And now, let us discuss the horror. The first horror comic came out in 1947. Eerie Comics by Avon. It was a one-shot comic book, just kind of an experiment to see how it would sell, and apparently didn't do well because there was not a second issue. All the art was by Joe Kubert, by the way. Now, there had been comic book stories with kind of a horror theme, with monsters and witches and what have you. But this was the first time there was a comic book entirely devoted to stories that could be described as horror. Well, it was a little bit ahead of its time, but not by much, because within a couple of years, horror was really starting to catch on. So, Avon picked back up with Eerie in 1951 and made it a regular ongoing series. The first issue reprinted some of the stuff from the 1947 version, and it lasted until 1954, and I think we all know why it ended in 1954, right? Because all the horror stuff did. We're not going to go into any further detail about EC Comics and their horror comics, or about the Senate hearings and all that stuff, formation of the CCA. We've covered all that really, really closely. So what we're going to do is jump ahead a little bit and see how things are playing out in the horror world in the Comics Code era. We're going to start by looking at a company that we've wound up mentioning several times up to this point, Warren Publishing, owned by James Warren, who is still kicking as of this summer at 90 years old. In 1958, Warren started a magazine with Forrest J. Ackerman. Not sure if that name is familiar, but we have talked about him. Last time we saw him, he was like 20 years old. He was the guy who, way back in the early 1930s, maybe it was even the late 20s, early 30s, had gotten together with, it was the early 30s, gotten together with Julius Schwartz and Mort Weisinger, and the three of them together had released the very first science fiction fanzine. And then he went on to also wind up being the very first person to ever cosplay at a science fiction horror convention back in the 1930s. Well, he is an expert in all things monster. So the magazine that Warren puts out is called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And Ackerman was the editor. He was the editor for almost the next 30 years. The magazine lasted well up into the 1980s. I remember buying it when I was a kid. It was not a comic book. It was a kind of a fan magazine. All kinds of articles about whatever the newest, most exciting upcoming horror movie might be, and also articles about classic horror movies and characters from the past. And it wound up being a huge success. It was kind of a gamble. Warren wasn't expecting it to do real well, but the first printing of 200,000 copies sold out almost immediately. And it went into a second printing, and it was a very successful magazine for the next couple of decades. It started to decline in the late 70s. Anyhow, the decision was made by Warren to branch out starting in 1964. And since there's so much interest in horror and monsters, to kind of reintroduce the horror comic book. Now, he wasn't in the comic book business. He was in the magazine business. So his horror stuff that his company put out was kind of like along the lines of what Mad Magazine had done, right? They had gone from being a four-color, regular comic book-sized book to being a larger black and white magazine, with a slick cover. So therefore, they did not come under the jurisdiction of the censors at the Comics Code Authority. So they could deal with all the things that comic books were no longer allowed to deal with. They were no longer allowed to even say the words horror or terror in the title. Can't have vampires or werewolves or any of that fun stuff. In the Warren black and white magazines, you could have all of that stuff you wanted. So 1964 saw the introduction of Creepy. 1966, let's recycle this name, Eerie. So Creepy and Eerie, those were the big horror magazines of the 60s and 70s. 1969 saw the introduction of Vampirella, a hyper-sexualized in her appearance lady vampire, who also wound up being very popular. Well, like I say, I was talking about Famous Monsters of Filmland. These other titles lasted for the same amount of time, up until the early 80s. And a lot of people who would go on to do work for the major comics companies got their start here. And the stories, like I said, they could tackle various things you couldn't see in the comics. And by the 1970s, they could even include, they were even likely to include some occasional nudity. Now, that was Warren, who, by the way, went out of business. He went bankrupt in the early 80s, and that's why the various magazines got shut down. There were, of course, imitators, some better than others. A lot of them just sort of popped up and lasted a few issues and then disappeared. Some of them had more staying power. Some of them in the 1970s were produced by Marvel. They had a black and white magazine division. That one of their most popular black and white magazines was Tales of the Zombie. Now, bear in mind that back then, pre The Walking Dead, Night of the Living Dead came out in 1968. That was kind of the mainstream introduction of the idea of zombies being a result of some kind of disease. But for the most part, when horror movies talked about zombies from the 1930s up into the 70s, they were talking about voodoo. They were talking about people who had died and been raised from the dead to be a mindless slave, not just like, flesh-eating monsters. Anyway, Marvel also had some of their characters, some of their third-string characters, get cycled through the black and white magazines. Meanwhile, in the four-color comics world, everyone's having to get that Comics Code Authority seal of approval, and if you're going to do that, you can't have vampires, you can't have any of this werewolves and all that stuff, but you could see those things on television. You could watch them on TV for free, and lots of kids did in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And Dell, who, remember, in the 1960s, Dell and Western had a bit of a break. So Gold Key kind of continued on what Dell had been known as Dell. They made these licensing deals with various television shows, like The Twilight Zone, Boris Karloff, Tales of Mystery, Dark Shadows. Well, Dark Shadows was a soap opera about a vampire. How are you going to avoid showing that? And at the same time, how can you argue that you can't show those things in a comic book when they're right there on television? In the case of Dark Shadows, not even at night. It was an afternoon soap opera. It came on usually, I think, around 3 o'clock, around the time kids were getting out of school, and so they would rush home to watch it. Then, in 1968, Joe Orlando got hired on as an editor at DC Comics. Now, Joe Orlando, we've talked about him. He had done a lot of science fiction and fantasy and horror at EC Comics back in the day. Now here he is, an editor, and he takes over these two comics, The House of Mystery and The House of Secrets. Now, The House of Mystery had been around since about 1950. I think House of Secrets started in 1956. So The House of Mystery, when it first started, horror comics were all the rage, and there was no Comics Code Authority. So they had witches and werewolves and vampires and stuff in this DC horror comic in the early 50s, but because it was DC, they didn't have intestines strung across the page and just like huge pools of blood and all that stuff. It was more tastefully done. But once that those Senate hearings happen, and once parents around the country are outraged because they believe that juvenile delinquency is on the rise because of vampires in comic books, then DC is no longer even really able to do some of those things, not even in their much more sanitized way of doing it. So the House of Mystery and the House of Secrets in the late 50s became more science fiction type stories. Mysterious, dangerous aliens coming. There were some of the giant monsters from outer space, the kind of stuff Jack Kirby was doing. But by the early 60s, actually, both of them had become superhero comics. House of Mystery featured stories about the Martian Manhunter, John Jones. And the House of Secrets was kind of like a rotating thing of various third-string DC heroes or tryout heroes to see how they would do. Orlando took over in 1968, and he decided to make horror horrifying again, CCA notwithstanding. So if you look at the May issue from 1968, that's before Orlando took over, and then you look at the June issue, there's a world of difference. Right away, this is creepy looking. This is scary looking, even if you don't know what is going on, which you don't. Also, that very month over in the House of Secrets, and you can see up in the upper left-hand corner, Orlando introduced hosts of these two stories, two diabolical brothers named Cain and Abel, who sort of played the same role that the Crypt Keeper had played in Tales from the Crypt. And they didn't have the gore, and they skirted right up to the edge and maybe tiptoed across the edge of what was allowed. But they were not shrinking back. Orlando was not shrinking back from scariness. Well, in 1971, the Comics Code Authority made a revision of their original rules from way back in 1954. So here's what the new rules are. All the other stuff still stands, but so far as horror, here's the new rules. Scenes dealing with, or instruments associated with, walking dead or torture shall not be used. Vampires, ghouls, and werewolves shall be permitted to be used when handled in the classic tradition, such as Frankenstein, Dracula, and other high-caliber literary works written by Edgar Allan Poe, Saki Conan Doyle, and other respected authors whose works are read in schools around the world. You know, this is another problem that they had faced. Classics Illustrated, which took famous novels and translated them into the comic book medium. Dracula is a famous novel by Bram Stoker. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is a famous novel. So these changes were now allowed, and immediately, of course, the comic book companies started to take advantage of this new loophole. Right away, 1971. 71, 72, within a few months of each other, a couple of months of each other, really, both Marvel and DC introduced a swamp monster, kind of modeled on the old Golden Age monster, the Heap. So DC had the Swamp Thing. Scientist Alec Holland, who winds up being attacked by bad guys trying to get his invention in the swamp, and then he winds up interacting with the swamp water and turns into a muck-encrusted, shambling heap of rotting vegetation. And then Marvel had the Man-Thing, who's scientist Ted Sallis, who is working on stuff in the swamp, and some bad guys want to get a hold of the things he's inventing, and he winds up being attacked and falling into the swamp, and the swamp water interacts with his chemicals and turns him into a shambling, shuffling, muck-encrusted, vegetative swamp monster. Big difference between them is that Swamp Thing had these weird things growing out of his face, and also the Swamp Thing was mindless. He was a vegetable, as it were, whereas the Swamp Thing still had the mind of Alec Holland, although he had a hard time talking. Also, Man-Thing was an empath. He was drawn by emotions, and pleasant emotions drew him like a moth to a flame, but negative emotions, especially fear, just drove him crazy. And then if he touched you and you were afraid, then you would catch on fire. So that's something a little bit original there. Now, which one of these was a ripoff of the other is a question that many people have asked, because they came out around the same time. And so far as we can tell, the creators of these two monsters hadn't really been in contact with each other. I think the most likely scenario is both of them were a ripoff of the Heap that immediately were trotted out because now you could do monsters. Now, right up until this time in 1971, when these loopholes opened, Marvel had kind of been trying to skirt along the edge of what they could get away with by introducing earlier that year, in the pages of The Amazing Spider-Man, the villain Morbius, the living vampire. Well, you're not allowed to have vampires. CCA hadn't made this change yet. So Morbius was not a supernatural vampire who had been bitten by somebody. He was a scientist who had been trying to develop a formula to cure himself of his blood disease, and instead it turned him into this powerful, monstrous creature that craved blood. So he's a vampire, but not like a traditional supernatural vampire. Then just a few months later, if they'd wanted to, they could have made him a vampire. Interestingly enough, I just recently rewatched some of the animated Spider-Man. I watched the whole thing. It's COVID, man. And when Morbius showed up on cartoons in the 1990s, instead of biting people and sucking their blood, he had these little sucker things like an octopus on the palms of his hands, and he would suck out your plasma. Because I guess on TV in the 90s, it was still considered way too spooky and out there to have someone biting you and sucking your blood. Anyway, 1972, the floodgates open, especially at Marvel. The floodgates of monsters. So now, if you want to use vampires or monsters and you use them in the classic sense, you can do that. What's more classic than Dracula? So, The Tomb of Dracula started 1972 by Marv Wolfman. You couldn't get a more appropriate name than that. And Gene Colan doing the artwork. So Dracula, therefore, became a character in the Marvel Universe. There was also the Frankenstein monster. He didn't catch on as much because he looked kind of goofy, and they couldn't make him look the same way that Universal Pictures Frankenstein looked. The introduction of the Ghost Rider, the modern Ghost Rider with a flaming skull. And Werewolf by Night, which is a character, and I'm not kidding, his name is Jack Russell. And he gets bitten by, well, actually, he doesn't get bitten by a werewolf. His ancestor had been cursed, and so whenever someone in the family line turns 18, they become a werewolf. Now, Marvel had done the same thing they had done with Morbius the year or two before. They'd had the character of John Jameson, the astronaut, son of J. Jonah Jameson, the Daily Bugle publisher, find this mysterious rock on the surface of the moon that turned him into a wolf-like creature, and he was called ManWolf. And that was before you could have werewolves. But he's not a werewolf. He's a man-wolf. It's all science, man. So now they can just have a straight-up werewolf. And so they do. Other things that were introduced by Marvel right off the bat in the early 70s, in the pages of Tomb of Dracula, among the supporting cast of, as part of the team of people that are trying to catch Dracula, you've got Blade, the vampire slayer, who is half vampire, and is African American. You also have a Haitian American character, Brother Voodoo, introduced, who has all kinds of magical powers. Later became Dr. Voodoo, and actually there's a little reference to him in the Doctor Strange movie. Anyhow, there was a problem, because according to the new rules, you could have vampires, you could have werewolves, you could have ghouls, but you can't have the Walking Dead. You can't have zombies. Now, why is that, I wonder? You know, there's not any classic novels about zombies. I'm not sure if there's many classic novels about, like, you know, flesh-eating ghouls either. But a lot of people believed that because zombies were associated with voodoo, that this was in part a race thing. Whether that's true or not, there was a problem in having a voodoo-related superhero when you can't have zombies, especially since this character was showing up regularly in the black and white magazine Tales of the Zombie, fighting zombies. But he can't fight zombies in color. So what they did is he's fighting zombies in black and white, but when it's in color, they call them Zuvembis. They never explain what a Zuvembi is. They just expect you to figure it out, because they can't use the word zombie. And just to show you how far things had gone, 1974, which was the year The Exorcist came out, and demonic possession just became kind of the buzzword in Hollywood. There had already been a lot of horror movies in the late 60s and early 70s about Satan-worshiping cults, and I'm not really sure what that's about, what that says about the zeitgeist. But Marvel released a comic, a character in Marvel Spotlight in 1974 called the Son of Satan. And he's called that because he's the son of Satan. Only, kind of like Shang-Chi and Fu Manchu, he doesn't really approve of Dad's business model, right? So he comes to Earth trying to undo some of the bad things Dad has done. He winds up being a member of the Defenders later on, actually marries the Hellcat. How appropriate is that? And so far as I know, plans are still on, as of the summer of 2020, for him to debut, although not even under that title, under the title of his alter ego, his name, Damon Hellstrom, with his own show on Hulu. But even Hulu can't call it the Son of Satan. The comic book business had changed a lot by the 1980s. Obviously, we'll be talking about that later. But the big change was that comics were mostly direct market, which is to say, they weren't sold in spinner racks and at newsstands very much, if at all. The vast majority of them by the late 1980s were being sold at comic book stores, comic book specialty shops, which was not the same thing as a newsstand. So comic book companies were able to put warnings on some of their books for mature audiences only, and eventually to have imprints like Vertigo from DC and Marvel Max from Marvel, and those things didn't have to have the CCA seal because they weren't going out to newsstands. So there were a lot of new options and a lot more leeway as to what could be done. All right, well, now I want to just quickly summarize the last few decades by hitting what I think are some high points. One of those is the introduction of John Constantine at DC, who first appeared in 1985 in the pages of the Swamp Thing during the iconic run on that comic by Alan Moore. John Constantine, who later got his own title in 1988 called Hellblazer. John Constantine is an occult detective and, as he describes himself, a working-class warlock who is very kind of hard-boiled noir with a very wry sense of humor. 1993 from Dark Horse Comics saw the introduction of Mike Mignola's Hellboy, who has made several appearances at theaters on the big screen, some more successful than others. And one graphic novel in particular that really has stood out to me was back in 2002. It was called 30 Days of Night. And in this graphic novel, a bunch of vampires moved to Alaska. They moved to Barrow, Alaska, because it's nighttime for 6 months out of the year. So they just go up there and have a field day. And that was made into a movie, which was pretty good, although the graphic novel's better. However, I would say that the biggest success story of the modern horror comic era would be Robert Kirkman's Image comic that came out in 2003, The Walking Dead, which just finished its run about a year ago in 2019 in a very dramatic and satisfying fashion. Ended the story. However, as we know, it has become, I think in 2011 is when it started on television, it's become a TV phenomenon that just never seems like it's going to end. And if you read the first few issues of the comic book and watch the first few episodes of the show, they're almost the same, except for the introduction of a couple of new characters in the show. But after not very long, things start to diverge, in part because, actors have lives, and sometimes they want to do other things. And so over the years, a lot of the characters have died on the show that did not die in the comics or didn't die yet. And some characters died early on in the comics that never died at all on the show. And then other characters that are big parts of the show were never in the comic book at all. So my point is, if you enjoy the show, or if you enjoyed the first few seasons, and like a lot of people, you feel like it kind of lost its way at some point, I highly recommend reading the whole run. I forget how many episodes, how many issues, something like 187, something like that. It was about a year away from hitting 200, but they called it early because they had come to the end of the story. It is, I think the comic book is a lot better than the show, and I think the show is pretty good. All right, well, that brings us squarely to the present.